Well, again, first of all, let me thank the organizers for the very nice and honored invitation to be here. And I want to thank Manuel Castells and Holberg for actually putting communications and media issues at the forefront of 21st century discussion. It's about time, so, you know, jolly well done, and it's great to be here. There's part of me listening both to Professor Thurborn and then to Professor Castells thinking, what's left for me to say? Because I do want to focus on the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And also listening to Terry, I think we perhaps have some interesting there are always, the longer the day goes on, the more lines of comparison and argument begin to emerge. I start with, and I take the point very much from Professor Castells, that he recognizes that the notion of global network society acknowledges that some places and people are more globalized and networked than others. And so it seems to me vital to differentiate between different regions and countries' integration into this putative system. Indeed, it makes good sense to look at societies on the border, not quite inside, not quite outside, to understand better how that system, and that system is in quote marks in my sentence, how that system functions, and to understand the role of communications and political logics of change in those areas. And again, as Castells has noted, we need to derive theory from context, not impose theory on context where it doesn't fit. So, in terms of the general system, I'm going to try and argue that some of these countries are actually very poorly integrated into the global network society. And the region that I'm interested in, the Middle East, has always actually been kind of problematic. The name is clearly a Western nominalization, and even there isn't agreement about which countries are included. Sometimes Afghanistan is included on the eastern border, sometimes Libya is included. My own college, SOAS, still likes to call it the near Middle East, and of course in distinction to the Far East. You know, and this is Sykes-Picot, 1918, when Britain and France, drew the lines in the sand. And the UN system has sort of now constructed MENA, the Middle East and North Africa. So finally, the Maghreb is sort of culturally integrated with the heartland of the Middle East. And many of the events happening in the region pose problems for all the political groupings that actually cross-cut this region, the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the African Union. I won't go into detail, but each of them has a particular definition of the region, how it would like the region to function, and the political changes that have just rolled out and are rolling out in front of our noses pose real political problems. So from European imperialism through lines in the sand to the axis of evil and 9/11, the West has exploited, mapped, projected, and misconstrued this region. And then suddenly there was the Iranian Green Movement, and then the so-called Arab Spring, a term first used in 2005 about abortive political upheavals in the region and reconstructed in 2011 to describe the wave of socio-political unrest that moved across the region, perhaps the most significant contiguous set of political upheavals since 1848. But for all the money, and again, this sort of echoes a point that Terry just made about Central Europe, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. For all the money, all the specialists, all the research, no one saw this coming. As my London colleague Tariq Sabri has argued, the first approach to events by Western experts and media alike was simply open-mouthed astonishment. And he acted out, what's going on? Our amazement has been conditioned by the repeated invitations of the political, military, and media establishments to see the region as our new enemy, made up of Islamic fundamentalists, autocratic and oil-rich, gender unequal, and as inimical terrain for democracy, despite our pouring millions of dollars into its democratization. Our political discourses, our immigration policies, our film semiotics, our mediated news, all have told us this. And indeed, a recently unearthed training manual from the US military is actually telling its students, this is a recent story from the Defense Department's Joint Forces Staff College, that America's real terrorist enemy wasn't Al-Qaeda, but the Islamic faith itself. This is all on the web if you want to look it up. So in a classic example of trying to have it both ways, while the West has supported, and some would say shored up, many of the most autocratic regimes for both economic and strategic reasons, the region is not well integrated into global structures, whether of trade, politics, or communication. While some countries are in the WTO, Bahrain, Morocco, Tunisia, many are not. Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, nor Iraq and Jordan. Nor is this region well integrated into the global network culture. A 2012 Connect Arab report suggested that based on ITU estimates, less than 30% of the population in the region were online by the end of 2011, and fixed broadband penetration stood at just above 2%, well above most other regions in the world average. Most countries in the region have launched 3G mobile services, and more people are using that, but still the estimate around 12% is well below the world average. And all the regional figures are inflated by the high take-up of internet in Bahrain and the UAE. So contentious political movements have been rolling out in countries with widely varying levels of internet penetration, ranging from less than 2%, Yemen, to 6%, Libya, 21 to 34%, Egypt, Tunisia, and Iran, and 88% Bahrain. Iran, of course, has been subject to US sanctions since the revolution, now even more firmly entrenched because of the putative threat of Iran's nuclear weapons, a linguistic phrase turned into global threat, while Iran itself finds new friends in India, China, and Latin America. I want to pose some similarities between the Iranian uprising of 2009 and the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions. These were all revolts against dictatorship or the spurious performance of a democratic spectacle in Iran, and in direct opposition to ruling regimes. These uprisings were all marked by demonstrations and the visible participation of young people, again, a common theme emerging about the generational nature of the politics, who often constitute the largest demographic group. All demonstrate the spirit of the time in which the world is no longer divided into two camps, but confronted with US hegemony and the globalization of finance capital. It was partly the harsh effects of neoliberal policies under Mubarak that precipitated recent events, as Professor Castells mentioned. And of course, they all happen in a period where advances in communications technologies, in particular the internet, allow for much faster circulation and dissemination of information. But while it's clear that these new media play some role in these movements, there's still no consensus on precisely what that role was. Each of these Middle East movements has been a real assemblage. Yeah, we do have code, Terry, you're absolutely right. You know, both in Sassen's descriptive sense, but also invoking Deleuze and Delander's development of assemblage as a set of emergent, contingent ensemble of practices and things. These assemblages have included mobilizing pre-existing political and social networks, face-to-face politics in place, the use of contemporary small media from social networks to mobile telephony and email, and old broadcast media, which also have played a role. And there have, of course, been a set of varied responses to popular dissent, including capitulation, negotiation, and violent repression. So the overhyped discourses and technologistic reduction of first Iran's green movement and then Tunisia's mobilization to Twitter revolutions, or Egypt as a Facebook revolution, or even the notion that this was Revolution 2.0, as Wael Ghonim, the Egyptian internet activist, has called it, actually have little explanatory value. Rather, they serve perhaps to inflate American corporate sensibility of contributing to the global spread of democracy, and possibly even to inflate their share prices. To compare Iran and the Arab experiences a little bit, and I'll use Iran a bit as the counterfactual, I'll try and talk about the significance of the combination of space versus place, online and offline, and then the dynamic of mobilization and demobilization and the difference between spectacle and social movement. So to the Iran story, briefly, and I'm aware of time. I argued 25 years ago, that long, in my book, Small Media, Big Revolution, that small media could no longer be considered the epiphenomena of political movements, but were rather significant potential tools of political mobilization. Iran staged a massive popular revolution in 1979 using cassette tapes, leaflets, graffiti, and huge street demonstrations, the outcome of which, of course, was the Islamic Republic. This is not to argue that such small media, which now we perhaps call social media, but I think there are perhaps some distinctions to be made, are indispensable for political change. Clearly, people have made revolution before without such tools. But let's say in repressive regimes where face-to-face public politics is extremely curtailed, most recently, a platform such as Facebook provided a space where silence and fear could be overcome and trust could be built, where social networks can turn political and where home and diaspora can come together. It could be said of Iran that all the constituencies of the 1979 movement, workers, women, students, actually remained quite mobilized. And as face-to-face politics became increasingly difficult under Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005, all these constituencies actually moved online and maintained a strong political presence online as the face-to-face became so difficult. The run-up to the June 2009 presidential election, brief history note, included huge rallies and football stadia, the first time women were legitimately allowed in these spaces. They're still fighting to actually be able to go to the football stadium to watch a match. The use of color coding, you know it, Mousavi cleverly selecting green, the color of Islam, the environment of peace, while the president's followers used the Iranian flag. The role of the supreme jurist and the public mandate of the revolution are the two twin pillars of legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. So in order to encourage participation in the election, the Islamic Republic finally allowed Facebook, which had been banned, and Iranians who are huge networkers embraced it with relish, sharing family photos and linking with friends around the world. After the election that gave Ahmadinejad 68% of the world, whoa, thank goodness not, 68% of the vote, demonstrations not seen since '79 filled the streets of Tehran and other cities in a powerful manifestation of somatic solidarity, and it was fascinating to watch Facebook literally turn green as people asked, "Where is my vote?" There is blood and there is death, and Facebook became one of the mobilizing elements of this. As Iran showed in 2009, as Tufekci and many others have argued, the online and offline worlds are connected, and there's an important link between face-to-face politics and more technologically mediated communication. But there are also different forms of repressive states, different histories of political action, and differentiated access to new forms of communication. So one size, one solution doesn't fit all. The conditions and mix of platforms differs from country to country. Even the Arab cases are very different. Tunisians faced a more pervasive police state than the Egyptians, with less latitude for blogging or press freedom, but their trade unions were stronger and more independent. For Egypt, as El-Robashi has argued, three forms of protest have been evident for many years: workplace protest, collective action by industrial laborers, civil servants, students, trade practitioners; second, neighborhood protest, single streets or towns, and even protest by minority groups like Copts and Sinai Bedouin were often organized along residential lines. And the third is associational protest that includes professional associations like lawyers and doctors, social movements as the pro-Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and the youth wings of political parties. The Kafaya movement had been blogging for many years, and numerous YouTube videos were in circulation showing police torture and previous bread riots. Many people have claimed, the best known perhaps, the best known blogger in Egypt, Hossam el-Hamlawi, has said the revolution was at least 10 years in the making. So I think that's a point I would argue with Professor Castells about in terms of the spontaneity. Clearly, there is a moment where there is another spark, but actually these political action has been there in the Middle East in perhaps ways we outside the region don't recognize. I've got various images. This is, of course, this is Tunisia. thanking Al Jazeera, who I'll come to. We want internet. This is Egypt, Facebook. Clearly, people within these countries are recognizing the importance of these networks. There's no denying that. And here are the terms up on public structures. So Facebook was important. Twitter was another way to keep in touch, to mobilize, to share useful suggestions. Bloggers, the Egyptian feminist Mona El Tahawi telling the world what was going on, or Gigi Ibrahim, the angry Egyptian, teaching young Egyptians how to blog and tweet. These platforms provide instantaneity, the immediate diffusion of and access to information, and extensivity, ignoring national borders and addressing domestic and diasporic populations and foreigners alike. But such internet practices intersect with intense face-to-face discussions in private social spaces amongst old and new collectivities. There's no sense, I think, in which these digital activities alone could have produced such social mobilization. And again, I've clearly written too much and there isn't time. In all of these mobilizations and others, we witness a renewed significance of place. The streets of Tehran and Tunis, the squares of Tahrir and Benghazi. Oh, here's someone else, even more platforms. I quite like this. Today, the recognition of place across borders. Today, Libya, tomorrow, Wall Street. Tahrir and the encampment in Tahrir. And Tahrir Square, as you mentioned, its invocation in other places. This is, of course, the Occupy movement on the steps of St. Paul's, creating big problems for the established church, but claiming this connection between the different mobilizations. So I think, actually, and I think we're beginning to do this better in media studies, we need to better recognize and theorize the continued importance of place as a physical matter, as a political matter, and as an economic matter. I think beyond the hype of flows and deterritorialized practices, we have to come down to earth to see the real importance of social space in the production of political change. When Mubarak, for example, closed down the internet, things didn't stop. Indeed, the primary channels of mobilization continued: face-to-face meetings, graffiti, posters, landline calls, and so on. And so, also, when Morozov, who appropriately warns us about the rise of the surveillance state in relationship to the internet, it's clear, I think, that the repressive forces in the region were far better trained and prepared for the physical repression of bodies than they were for control of the internet. Pulling the plug on the internet is a very crude and actually self-harming response. It loses you a lot of revenue, and it annoys your business and bazaar-y communities, as well as closing down your bloggers. And as significant, and again it's been mentioned, I think as significant as the new social media platforms has been the role of broadcasting, like Al Jazeera Arabic and BBC Arabic, which played a multiplier role in extending these events not only across the region, but also making them global events, often relying on eyewitness materials sent in by citizen journalists. Al Jazeera, I think, was quite brilliant at using split-screen technique. It showed some of the last speeches by Mubarak, and it also showed the people in Tahrir Square throwing their shoes in the air as the instantaneous response to Mubarak. It was clear that things were coming to an end. As I understand it, there was competition between who held the remote control in Tahrir. Was it Al Jazeera going to be showed, or BBC Arabic? And of course, in the US, Hillary Clinton famously berated the US media for its poor coverage, which was delivering audiences to Al Jazeera. We know the demographic across the region is youthful, and much of the politics has been an intergenerational challenge, and I quite take Professor Castell's point. It's the new generation, it's the people under 35, under 40 across the region who are going to make the politics and who are making the politics. And there's clearly more to come. Not all of the Arab region has risen by any means, and we see still Syria tearing itself apart, Bahrain, Yemen still unresolved. I would argue they weren't significantly transnational movements and didn't display much regional activity, and these are all hedging terms. But the Arab Spring revealed the ongoing significance of national politics. Visually, we've seen the important symbolism of flags in every country. In Libya, the fight around the flag was absolutely central of different versions. It was a struggle for symbolic domination through the flag. There was very little invocation of either the Muslim Ummah or of Pan-Arabism, but neither has there been much evidence of concentrated social media use across regional borders. There were some messages of solidarity to and from Wisconsin, Madrid, and London, indications that global youth may still defy difficulties to better integrate their political activities and become a counter-movement to the global network society. The most significant element of transnational connectivity, I would argue, were the deterritorialized national diasporas, whether in Dearborn or Manchester or Paris, who were reconnected to national politics and then helped to disseminate images of the national struggle to Western media. So I've invoked a form of non-Foucauldian biopower, somatic solidarity on the streets, the presence of others, the significance of pre-existing social and political networks, the power of place, the role of old transnational broadcasters, and various new media platforms, the complex mix of networks, of assemblages that constitute contemporary political life in the region. The Arab Springs were successful in throwing off aging dictators with decades of repressive rule, and they're perhaps best compared actually to the dynamics of 1979 in Iran rather than 2006. The considerably more internet-savvy Green movement was unsuccessful, perhaps because it's hard to produce a second revolution in the shadow of the first. Its leaders remain under house arrest, and more Iranians have joined the global diaspora. A considerable number of green-inflected pages still continue, but a final form of power I'd like to invoke is the ability to undermine regime narratives and attempts at ideological hegemony, the challenge of meaning systems. An early example of this is the response to the Islamic Republic's arrest of a student leader and dressing him in hijab to undermine his potency. This happened just after the presidential election. The instantaneous satirical response was of hundreds of Iranians and non-Iranian men photographing themselves in scarves and posting their images online. How proud they were, the Iranians said, to wear the coverings of their mother, and how proud they were to identify with women's struggles around the world. Another humorous call and response occurred in February this year, as the regime celebrated the 33rd anniversary of the revolution with a cardboard cutout of Khomeini arriving in Tehran on a jumbo jet, later taking tea with representatives of the regime. A gift for Iranian photoshoppers. Within 24 hours, a web page displayed Khomeini on the moon, at the royal wedding, and, I didn't include it, sorry, and at Kim Il-sung's funeral. Such satirical brio suggests a political opposition that is lurking, alive but not active, waiting for its moment to come. And my final point, after rapid mobilization, which I think is a curiously militaristic metaphor, often comes rapid and enforced demobilization. In fact, there's just been a demand for the return to normality by the Fulul candidate, the candidate who actually grows out of Mubarak's political system in the Egyptian presidential election. We've done it, go home, everything's over. Certainly the performance of a democracy through elections matter and is a huge improvement on the past. We've seen Libyans and Egyptians and Tunisians enjoying, relishing their ability to participate in elections, and we've seen a whole panoply of media supporting election campaigns. But we also clearly see that Libya is very concerned about schisms and violence, as is Tunisia. The presidential choice in Egypt is between the Muslim Brotherhood or someone from the past regime, and their periodic regathering now in Tahrir suggests an ongoing political dynamic. As Cavada says, the greater ease and speed of online communication does not necessarily lead to durable and stable activist networks, at least not in the traditional sense. Indeed, all these countries are arguing for, and we, the question from Norway too, we need socioeconomic emancipation, which has to include jobs with decent salaries, awareness of rights to eliminate corruption, to support the emancipation of women and minorities, the rule of law, actually participatory democracy, not simply the ability to vote. Hossein El-Hamlawi, an Egyptian activist, neatly put it, we need to take Tahrir to the factories, to the universities, and to the workplace. And I'll invoke, as my final parting shot, or I would invoke the British pop group The Who sang years ago, I'll tip my hat to the new constitution, take a bow for the new revolution, smile and grin at the change all around me. Then I'll get on my knees and pray that we don't get fooled again. Thank you.